Hey everyone, Rob Janicki here, author of Slacker, 1991, Teen Spirit Angst, and the Generation It Created. Due out this fall through Inspired by You books. It is available for pre-order now. There's a link in the comments if you'd like to check that out. Today's video is a little bit different than some other videos, in a way, just because of who I'm talking about. But the ideas and the connection between generations, as far as music is concerned, is ultimately the same as what I've been talking about on this channel and through Generation Riff and other writings I've done, Instagram videos and whatnot. So yesterday was August 5th, 2024, and it's a significant day for me. It was my daughter's birthday. One of my favorite artists and bands of all time, Beastie Boys, their de facto leader, if you will, MCA, was also born on that date, Adam Yauch, otherwise known as MCA. As you know, he is no longer with us, but he was a huge inspiration to me as far as listening to music, what kind of music I can listen to. Beastie Boys broke a ton of ground in the mid-'80s, as did other early rap bands and artists. And it just kind of gave me this new direction and this new possibility, or the possibilities of new music to listen to other than rock and hard rock and pop and metal, which I still all listen to, or still listen to all of that now. But back in the 80s, it was a big deal, still is, and rest in peace, MCA. Also on August 5th, but back in 1966, the Beatles released Revolver. It was their 7th album, and they're probably known for other albums more so than Revolver. Obviously the early albums that introduced them to the world and the pop sensation they became. And then later on, Magical Mystery Tour, Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles are probably still the biggest band ever, at least in terms of popularity throughout the decades. We still have 2 of them left, in Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, and their music is highly influential even now. And that's kind of why I picked Revolver to discuss. Music is very much about timing, and what I mean by that is its relevance or its importance or its influence has a lot to do with timing, as well as obviously the sound of the music itself. And there's always context that you have to add to discussions about music. So when people say, oh, who's better, the Beatles or the Stones or Zeppelin or the Who, these were arguments that we had as kids growing up. Or in the decade that I write about, in the 90s for the most part, Nirvana or Pearl Jam or Soundgarden or Alice in Chains or Stone Temple Pilots, and the list goes on and on and on. And you can do it in any genre, you can do it in any time period. But Revolver, you have to think about it not just in its sound, which is ridiculous. It's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, is because the Beatles basically used the studio as an instrument. And it was probably the first time. I'm sure there were underground bands that had done things like that, and very sort of, left of pop music center bands that did crazy things in the studio. But I'm talking about a band that was widely known. By 1966, the Beatles were massive. They were the biggest band in the world. They started to change right before Revolver came out. 1965, they released Rubber Soul, and a lot of people think, and I agree, that Rubber Soul was kind of the point where they went from, essentially a pop boy band playing British-style American blues and popping it up a little bit, to being a little bit more experimental and a little bit more of themselves in terms of their artistic vision. Rubber Soul was certainly that for the Beatles. However, I think Rubber Soul came out late in 65, And then I don't think it was a full year actually, or maybe just about. I don't remember. I'd have to look it up. But 65 was Rubber Soul. 66 was Revolver. Revolver is the record, in my opinion, that took the Beatles to a stratosphere that they've still not come down from. And what I mean by that is, yes, they became more popular with other records. They're more known for other records and songs, for sure, than some that were on Revolver. Although Eleanor Rigby is one of their most popular songs, and Taxman and things like that. Got to Get You Into My Life. You know, you can look at the track listing. But Revolver went from, or I should say the Beatles went from a standard vocal, guitar, bass, drum, and keys sometimes type band to using instruments that a lot of pop musicians didn't use. Certainly not in America or England. I mean, they were using the sitar, they were using tape loops, they were using different types of organs and all sorts of keys, very different production styles. It was kind of the beginning of maybe, what later would become electronic music. Obviously, the technology is night and day between now and what was available in 1966. Even from 66 into, say, the 80s, things had changed drastically in the studio. But the Beatles were able to take what was available in 66 and turn all of the, what would I phrase it as? All of the available sounds or ideas that a studio could provide, and basically write songs to what was available, if that makes sense. So yes, they had ideas for songs and probably written on acoustic guitar and piano, as most songs typically are, and certainly back then were written on and for those instruments. But the Beatles used the influence and the artistic direction, if you will, of the studio and what was available, specifically tape loops and instruments that weren't on pop records, and the very beginnings of electronic music, and wrote songs on Revolver for those techniques. And that marked a very important time in history because, again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning. If you're a band that is at its height, its apex, that you're the biggest band in the world, and not many bands have gotten there, obviously, over time. And not many, if any at all, have lasted at that level as the Beatles. So I guess there's two schools of thought. When you're that big, I guess you can do anything you want because no one's going to say anything to you. Your fan base may dwindle a little bit, but not enough to the point where people still won't love you. So maybe that's why they were able to make such a drastically different record with Revolver than anything they had done before. Or being that big and being that big at a young age. I mean, the Beatles were kids when they started, very, very young men, and they matured artistically. They matured as people. They started experimenting with drugs, hallucinogenics, LSD. Obviously, they were all smoking marijuana. They were looking for something by 66 that would take their art in a different direction, and they nailed it on Revolver. So the natural artistic progression that comes with age, that comes with experience, that comes with becoming better at your instrument and what you do, and the idea that they were the biggest band in the world and they could do whatever they want and no one was really going to say anything to them. I think those two things collided and allowed them to create Revolver. Now, when I look back to the 90s and everything I wrote about in Slacker, which is really the early 80s through 1999, and the alternative and grunge movement, basically becoming the pop music of the time, the popular music of that era. Revolver really paved the way for all of that Because if you're a band, think about it this way. If you're an artist of any kind and you see the biggest band in the world take a massive left turn off the road that they were on and do something drastic, different, creatively brand new, and you could argue like I said earlier, I don't think this would have happened, but you could argue that it could have really damaged their career, being putting something out that was so different from what their fans were used to. I believe that allowed the bands that were coming up in the early and mid 80s, specifically out of Seattle, but all over the country and the world, but we'll keep it to the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest of the United States. They were hearing sounds on top 40 radio and the popular music of the time, and they weren't liking what they heard, and they wanted to change it up, and they wanted to do something different, and they changed tunings, and they did do different things in the studio. They used very, very serious and important topics to talk about lyrically, socially, personally, politically, religiously. You can argue that that was an instrument in and of itself. But again, I really do believe that the Beatles were able to, with Revolver, give a direction to those that would come after them to change things up whenever they wanted, however they wanted, still be accepted, and increase their artistic output to levels that they probably never would have been able to before. Or if they were able to do that, it would have taken a lot longer. It would have looked and sounded different. And I don't think as many people would have done it. The record industry, the music industry is very much a copycat industry at times, especially the top 40 stuff and the popular music. Everybody wants, not everybody, but most people want to become famous, and they want to become rich, and they want to become globally known. And usually that means copying what's popular and trying to stand out with that. And the Beatles didn't do that. And artists that became huge in the 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, and throughout the decade, for the most part, didn't do that. And I think, or I would argue, that we have Revolver to thank for that. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have comments, if you want to talk about this a little further, please do. I'm always up for a good conversation, and hope to see you all soon. Thanks.